I'm David Bernholdt, and I will kick us off this afternoon, actually. Let's get the right thing up here. There we go. So first of all, I want to encourage you to visit our tutorial website. You should be able to easily find the particular page for today's tutorial. This will have the latest updates and some information about hands-on activities that you can do and things like that. I'm going to briefly mention this, and then we're going to skip over it in all of our future slides. We are licensing this material under Creative Commons. If you want to cite this material, we have a requested citation here. These presentations are also in Figshare if you want to reference them later. And we'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors at the U.S. Department of Energy for supporting this work. As I said, I'm David Bernholdt. Today we'll also have Anshu Dubey, Rinku Gupta, and David Rogers. And hopefully you can recognize them as we go along from their pictures. We are members of the Ideas Productivity Project, which is part of the Exascale Computing Project. And we work in various ways with the ECP community and also the broader community to improve developer productivity and software sustainability as a key part of increasing overall scientific productivity. So there's a lot of different things that we do. This tutorial is one of the activities. We'll point out a few other things that we do as we go along and reference them. There's a DOI at the bottom here if you want to see more details about our overall activities. One thing I would like to highlight is the Better Scientific Software site, bssw.io. This is a community-based resource for scientific software improvement. So we've started this, but we solicit contributions from the community, and of course the resources are out there for the community to use. So please visit that and consider contributing. And if you're interested in following us after you've heard a little bit more about what we have to say, we have a mailing list for the project that we advertise a lot of events. You may have heard of the Best Practices for HPC Software Developers webinar series. It's a monthly webinar series. We have strategies for working remotely panel today, which we're actually conflicting with this tutorial, but we have a variety of things. We announce those on that mailing list, and then the BSSW site has a monthly digest. We highlight new resources. So the overall objective of this tutorial is to help present some best practices in software engineering with an explicit focus on computational science and engineering, with the clear, obvious goal of increasing software quality in computational science and engineering, and also the sustainability and productivity that comes from it. We're really interested in targeting anybody who works in this space. A lot of what we'll talk about emphasizes small teams, but in our experience, larger teams are often made up of smaller teams, small clusters of people who work together on topics and then interact a little bit more loosely with a larger team. So we're not going to be prescriptive in this tutorial. We're trying to provide information, things for you to think about, examples, and pointers to other resources. In practice, what we would recommend is a series of small incremental improvements to work on your software processes. We want to emphasize adoption of practices that help productivity rather than just put an unsustainable burden on your project. And it's really important to customize these things as needed for each project. One of the challenges that we find, one of the reasons that software engineering often gets a bad name in the CSE world, is because people have tried to take it and apply it from the commercial software experience and just take it into the CSE experience. And it's a little bit of a different world. So we need to be a little more thoughtful and customize our practices. Fundamental message here is remember that your code is going to live a lot longer than you expect, so you should prepare for it from the beginning. To the question in the chat, the slides are available. If you visit the website, you can find the link to the Figshare site where they're available right now, and you can follow along. We have a few hands-on activities. This is a short tutorial, so we don't really have time to go through them today, but you're welcome to work on them on your own. It is a basic physics problem, but you don't need to understand the physics or math to do the exercises in this tutorial. You're welcome to do these and submit pull requests, and we will provide you feedback on these pull requests, or you can reach us offline. I'll have how to do that in a moment. So you can find the instructions for the hands-on activities also on the tutorial website, the very same one I just had in the chat. So we really do want to interact with you. These tutorials are most interesting and informative for everyone. If you ask questions and share your experiences, we learn too. That's one of the reasons we actually give these things, to interact with people and hear their experiences, what works for them. So please use chat to ask questions at any time. We'll answer either verbally or back in the chat. We'll answer as many as we can, but if we aren't able to get to your question, please feel free to follow up with us afterwards. As I said, if you work on the hands-on activities, we'll be glad to provide feedback on those. And there's an email address here, which we'll also put in the chat, which is how you can reach us after the fact. All right, and with that, I'm going to move on to my next presentation, which is the actual overview of what we'd like to talk to you about this afternoon. All right, so really a fundamental message that we want to convey throughout this tutorial is the idea that science through computing is at best as credible as the software that produces it. And that really has a lot of implications. As many of you will know, computational science has been really evolving very quickly. There's kind of a virtuous cycle or a positive feedback loop here. More complex or more capable computers are allowing us to implement more complex models and run those models and analyze the results and improve our scientific understanding, further improve the models, make use of even more hardware resources. And this kind of goes around pretty quickly these days. But by the same token, every time we make the hardware more complex or different, we change the hardware, or every time that we're making the model more sophisticated, or we're introducing multi-physics coupling because we've realized that's important to get everything right, we introduce more complexity into the software, and that creates challenges for us. We tend nowadays to work in larger teams with more detailed expertise in different members of the team, and more people, and it becomes harder and harder to work effectively together on the software without some basic software engineering processes in place. And so this is the world that we're working in today. And this is why we feel the ideas presented in this tutorial are very relevant and timely. As you probably realize, scientific computing facilities or scientific facilities of any kind provide a lot of valuable resources. Major supercomputers often cost more than $100 million to procure and then millions of dollars to operate annually. And so a significant allocation on a large supercomputer can be worth literally millions of dollars. You may not have to pay for that, but you have to spend the time and effort to get the allocation. And then your sponsor and the sponsor of the computer is going to be concerned about whether you're being a good steward of the resources, and you should be concerned about whether you're getting the most science possible out of your work. And a lot of these factors have to do with the quality of your software. We've all heard of many software-related scientific failures. If you go back 30 years or so, the Therac 25 was a computer-controlled radiation therapy system, and a poor software design and poor testing practices allowed some flaws to get into the system that that led to some substantial radiation overdoses, and at least 3 of those that we know of were fatal. And then back in 1999, the Mars Climate Orbiter is another very well-known example. One component didn't follow the specifications for the units of measure to be used in the system, and there wasn't adequate testing across that interface. And so it wasn't found until the orbiter was actually over Mars, and then it failed. And these are just two examples. There's plenty of others. And here's an example actually from Anshu's experience, which is a little more subtle and a little more detailed, but maybe a little more realistic. It's not quite as high profile as the other two, but this is a real thing that we can encounter in everyday computational science and engineering, even if we're not sending a probe to Mars or something like that. In 2005, the Flash astrophysics team was offered an opportunity to access one of the fastest machines in the world at that time. It was a Blue Gene L. And they had a short time to prepare for this. They were given less than a month to prepare for a 1.5 week dedicated run. So they did some quick and dirty development in the code to introduce a particle tracking capability. And it turns out that when they implemented that, they introduced an error that resulted in some duplicated tags from round-off errors. And as a result, they had to develop post-processing tools to correctly track identify the trajectories, which took 6 months to process the results. This all happened with a good software process in place in the Flash project. It was tested regularly, but this was an instance where they couldn't apply their full rigorous software process because of time constraints. And so basically what happened to them and what happens to us in many cases is they accrued technical debt. The Wikipedia definition of technical debt is the cost, implied cost of additional rework caused by choosing an easy or limited solution now instead of a better approach that would take longer. And of course, that makes it sound like a choice. Often it is a choice, but sometimes, as in Anshu's example, under significant time pressures, you may not have the freedom to do the longer term solution. So you may have no choice but to accrue some technical debt. And like monetary debt, the more technical debt you accumulate, the harder it is to pay off. It increases the cost of maintenance. Parts of the software may become unusable over time. And inadequately verified software produces questionable results. And it also makes it harder for new developers to get on board. And overall, just really reduces your software productivity and your science productivity. So this is why we're concerned about these things. And there's a lot of challenges, a lot of reasons that we might be pressured to accept an easy way out and introduce more technical debt in these days, right? All parts of the system that we're working on in computational science and engineering software could be under research while we're trying to develop them. The requirements change throughout the life cycle as our understanding of the software and the problem and the needs grow and change. Verification of these codes typically involves floating point computations, and that can be more complicated to verify correctly and carefully than just straight integer computations. And we're trying to model the real world, and it's messy out there, and as a result, our software gets messy too. In addition to that, we have this increasing hardware diversity that we're facing these days. And then there's also the sociological component to it. So we all have competing priorities and incentives, and admittedly, sponsors often care more about the scientific publications than the software or the software quality, even though that's really fundamental underlying the publications that are produced. We have limited resources. We need to interact with many different people, different kinds of expertise, and we have to, be able to work together effectively, which can be a challenge. But fundamentally, good scientific process requires good software practices. And we find also that good software practices increase software sustainability, and both and good software practices and software sustainability both act to increase scientific productivity. So this is an argument for why these kinds of things are important to think about. Some of the best practices we'd like you to think about, first of all, invest in an extensible design for your code, use version control and automated testing, institute a rigorous verification and validation scheme, for your code, and define and enforce coding and testing standards, as well as clear and well-defined processes for how you're going to audit the code, carry out maintenance, how you're going to distribute it, what contributors have to do for their contributions to be accepted, and how you're going to document the code. Some things to layer on top of that we consider desirable. Be good at tracking the provenance of your code and think about reproducibility of your software, your numerical experiments. Think about the whole life cycle of the code and how you can manage that. And we find that open development of software and frequent releases are a good practice to just help keep things open, keep things public, and engage more people more effectively in the process. So we're going to focus on aspects of these kinds of issues that are really particular in various ways to scientific software, and let you look elsewhere for some of the more generic software engineering best practices and help with those. And one last thing we're going to advocate here, as I mentioned before, an incremental software improvement process. So the goal, we think, should be to have just enough software engineering that you can meet your short-term and long-term scientific goals effectively. So a way to think about this is to first identify your team's pain points in your software development processes, find one thing to improve, set a goal for that. You should target processes, not behaviors, and something that you you should target processes and behaviors, not just tasks that would improve. Write better documentation is a task. How can you ensure that everybody is writing better documentation, and updating that documentation is a process or a behavior? Pick something you can address in a few months that'll give you a noticeable benefit. Agree on a plan to address it, and how will you decide when you're adequately done? Then work to your plan, track your progress. When you meet all these markers, have a little celebration, and then you can go along and find the next pain point that you want to tackle. And over time, what you'll find is that you're bending down this curve instead of the red curve where the cost just increases over time. Then with the new process, the idea is that maybe you put in a little more work to adopt a practice, but then it's going to help you save in the long run. And we talk a little bit more about this at the URL that's there, bsswio.io/PSIP. That stands for Productivity and Sustainability Improvement Planning. So with that, I'm at the end of my introduction